He is one of the most famous men alive. But the father who raised him was living under a borrowed name, carrying a buried past, and holding a secret so carefully sealed that not even his own son knew the truth. It took a laboratory, a genealogy database, and decades of waiting for the silence to finally break. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and do not forget to subscribe. Jackie Chan has made a career out of surviving. He has fallen from skyscrapers, been dragged behind buses, and leaped across rooftops in countries he could barely pronounce. He has broken nearly every bone in his body in service of giving audiences something they had never seen before. Through all of it, he has been the most open kind of celebrity, willing to talk about his failures, his regrets, his complicated relationships, his difficult childhood. He has written books about his life. He has sat in front of cameras for decades and answered questions most stars would dodge. And yet for most of his life, Jackie Chan did not know who his father really was. Not because his father was absent. Charles Chan was present. He was disciplined and hardworking, and deeply committed to his family in the reserved, quiet way that defined a certain generation of Chinese men who had seen too much to be comfortable with softness. He cooked, he worked, he held things together. But the man behind those habits, the man who existed before Hong Kong, before the name Charles Chan, before the new life he had constructed with such deliberate care, that man was invisible, even to his son. When researchers finally ran the DNA tests, what they revealed changed the shape of Jackie Chan's entire story. It also raised questions that stretched far beyond one family. To understand what the science uncovered, you need to start somewhere that has nothing to do with laboratories or genetic databases. You need to start in the 1940s, in a China that was fighting two wars at once, and losing both of them in different ways at the same time. China in the late 1930s and the 1940s was a country in the process of being destroyed. Japan had launched a full invasion in 1937, and the brutality of what followed ranks among the most catastrophic events of the entire 20th century. Cities were bombed and burned, civilian populations were massacred, provinces fell under occupation. At the same time the Japanese invasion was grinding through the country, the Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was fighting a civil war against communist forces under Mao Zedong. These two conflicts ran simultaneously, bleeding into each other, creating a situation where ordinary people had no safe side to stand on, and no guarantee that surviving one threat would protect them from the other. The men who served in the nationalist military during this period came from every province in China. They were farmers, clerks, and school teachers who had been conscripted or volunteered into a cause that was, by the late 1940s, clearly losing. When the Communists achieved final victory in 1949 and the People's Republic of China was formally established, the consequences for anyone associated with the nationalist side were severe: show trials, imprisonment, execution for those considered enemies of the new state, and a mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of people who understood exactly what the new order would mean for them if they stayed. Among those people was a man from Shandong province in northeastern China, a man who had served the nationalist cause, a man who, when he made it across the border into British Hong Kong, made a decision that he would carry for the rest of his life. He became Charles Chan. His real name was Fang Daolong. The province of Shandong sits on the eastern coast of China, jutting out into the Yellow Sea between Beijing to the north and Shanghai to the south. It is one of the most historically significant regions in all of China. This is where Confucius was born. This is where some of the earliest recorded Chinese civilization took root. The Yellow River reaches the sea through Shandong, and the soil along its banks fed populations for thousands of years before the first dynasty was established. It is also a place that has been fought over, invaded, occupied, and contested throughout its entire history, precisely because of its strategic position and its resources. When the Japanese military swept into northeastern China in the 1930s, Shandong was among the first regions to experience the full weight of the occupation. The violence was systematic. Villages were burned, populations were moved. The men who survived and joined the resistance, whether through the nationalist military or through local guerrilla networks, did so knowing that capture meant death. Fang Daolong survived all of it. How exactly, the records are incomplete enough that a precise account is difficult to reconstruct. What is clear from the genealogical research and the DNA findings is that he was from this province, that he was connected to the nationalist military apparatus during the war years, and that when the political landscape shifted permanently in 1949, he was among those who chose exile over submission. Hong Kong in 1949 was receiving people in exactly this situation by the thousands. The British colonial administration was overwhelmed. The infrastructure of the city was strained to breaking point. And in that chaos, a man who needed to start over had, if not exactly opportunity, at least the kind of obscurity that a fresh start requires. No one was checking very carefully who you were in the crush of that particular moment in history. No one was cross-referencing names against nationalist military rosters in the middle of a refugee crisis of that scale. Fang Daolong stepped into that obscurity and emerged as Charles Chan. In Hong Kong, Charles Chan built the kind of life that does not attract attention. That was almost certainly the point. He found work. He found a woman named Li, who would become Jackie's mother. He established a household. In 1954, his son, Chan Kong Sang, was born in a rented room in a Hong Kong that was already becoming something different from the chaotic arrival point it had been 5 years earlier. Jackie Chan was 7 years old when his parents enrolled him in the China Drama Academy, a residential Peking opera school run by the legendarily demanding Master Yu Jim Yuen. The training at that school was, by contemporary standards, something close to what we would now call institutional child abuse. The children trained for up to 18 hours a day. Physical punishment was routine. Failure was not tolerated. And Jackie, who would eventually perform under the stage name Sing Lung, which means becoming the dragon, endured 10 years of this before he was released into the world. Charles Chan, during those years and after, was working at the French Embassy in Hong Kong, and then in Canberra, Australia, where the family eventually relocated. He cooked. He managed. He was, by all accounts, a good father within the emotional constraints of his generation and his experience. He never raised the subject of Shandong. He never mentioned the name Fang Daolong. He never described what the war years had been like, or what leaving China had cost him. He kept those years sealed behind a silence so complete that his son had no idea there was anything behind it. Jackie Chan became famous in the late 1970s, and then globally famous through the 1980s and the 1990s. He watched his father age from a distance, busy with the career that had consumed his life. Charles Chan died in 2008 at the age of approximately 93, having never spoken publicly about who he had been before Hong Kong. Whatever he was protecting by that point was more habit than necessity. The man he had been afraid of in 1949 was long gone. The China he had fled had changed beyond recognition, but the silence remained, the way old habits do, long after the original reason for them had passed. The documentary program that finally broke the silence was part of a wave of genealogy-focused television that emerged across Asia in the late 2010 ES. The format had proven enormously successful in Western markets, where shows built around celebrity ancestry had become major cultural events. The appeal was straightforward. There is something universally compelling about watching a famous person discover that their family history is more complicated, more surprising, more human than their public image suggests. In the Chinese context, the format carried a particular emotional weight because the disruptions of the 20th century had fractured so many family histories so completely. The generation that survived the war and the Civil War and the communist victory had, in enormous numbers, done exactly what Charles Chan had done. They had changed names, crossed borders, buried the past, and built new lives without looking back. Their children and grandchildren were living with the gaps that silence creates. Entire family trees with branches that simply stopped, with origins that were sketched rather than filled in, with questions that had no living person left to answer them. When Jackie Chan agreed to participate in genealogical research for a Chinese documentary program, he knew there might be surprises. He had said in various interviews over the years that his father's past was something he had always been curious about, but had never been able to fully access. There were hints. There had always been hints. His father's military bearing, his father's absolute refusal to discuss certain periods of his life, the way he would redirect conversations that came too close to questions about the mainland. The researchers began with the documentary and historical record. Military rosters from the nationalist period, household registration records from the early years of British Hong Kong, immigration documentation from the mass arrival period of 1949 and 1950. These records were incomplete, damaged, sometimes deliberately destroyed, but they were cross-referenced against genetic data, against the DNA sample that had been collected from Jackie Chan himself as part of the program's methodology. The result came back unambiguous. The paternal line, traced through the Y chromosome that passes unchanged from father to son through generations, confirmed the Shandong origin. The DNA matched against records associated with the family name Fang. The genealogical research combined with the genetic data produced a name that Jackie Chan had never heard spoken in his home growing up. Fang Daolong, his father's real name. Jackie Chan's on-camera reaction when the researchers presented this finding has been described by everyone who witnessed it as one of the most quietly devastating moments of the entire program. He did not cry, at least not immediately. He sat with the information in the way that people sit with something that is simultaneously completely surprising and somehow on a level that bypasses conscious thought, not surprising at all. He had known there was something there. He had felt it in the silences. He had noticed the things his father never talked about and filed them away as part of who his father was. A private man, a man shaped by hard times, a man who had survived things he did not discuss. But now there was a specific thing, a specific name, a specific province, a specific life that had existed before the life Jackie thought he knew. He said after the silence that he wished his father could have told him. Not that he was angry, not that he felt betrayed. What he expressed was grief, a particular kind of grief that belongs to people who discover they have missed a chance to know someone more fully. Charles Chan had died 6 years before this documentary was filmed. There was no conversation to be had, no questions that could be answered directly. The man who knew the whole story was gone. And all that was left was the genetic record and the fragmentary documentary evidence, and the name Fang Daolong hanging in the air of a television studio, finally spoken out loud for the first time since whoever had last said it in Shandong decades ago. The DNA findings went beyond the name. Once researchers had established the genetic signature of Jackie Chan's paternal line, they were able to do something no document search could accomplish. They traced that line back through time, past the point where written records exist, past the disruptions of the 20th century, past the Ming and Qing dynasties, all the way back to the ancient population movements that shaped the genetic landscape of northern China. The haplogroup associated with Jackie Chan's paternal line is one of the major lineages found throughout northern and northeastern China. It carries markers that point to origins in the ancient populations of the Yellow River Valley, the agricultural heartland of early Chinese civilization. These are genetic signatures thousands of years old, connecting the living person back to the communities that first developed many of the practices and traditions we now associate with Chinese culture. The farming, the ritual, the written language, the philosophical traditions that Confucius himself was drawing on when he taught in Shandong 25 centuries ago. This is what makes DNA genealogy different from any other form of historical research. Documents can be burned, names can be changed, borders can close, and populations can scatter. But the Y chromosome carries its record forward regardless. Every generation adds nothing to it and removes nothing from it. It is the same molecule that was present in the earliest men of that lineage, passed through every son who ever lived, arriving finally in Jackie Chan, carrying all of that ancient information in a form modern science can read. For Jackie Chan, this meant that the discovery of his father's secret was not simply a revelation about wartime survival and political exile. It was a connection to a lineage stretching back to the very foundations of Chinese civilization. The secret his father kept was a modern secret, a product of the particular violence and dislocation of the mid-20th century. But underneath that secret was something ancient and continuous and unbroken. The maternal line offered its own dimension to the story. Jackie Chan's mother, Li, had herself come from Shandong province. The fact that both of his parents originated from the same region of China before meeting and marrying in Hong Kong is itself a small piece of historical poetry. They were both part of the same great displacement, both carried by the same catastrophic tide from the same place to the same destination. They found each other in the wreckage and built something new. The mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child and traces the maternal line, confirmed the Shandong connection. But it also revealed something about the deeper history of that maternal line, pointing to genetic markers associated with the ancient populations of northeastern China, groups who had been living in that region since long before the formation of the dynasties that most people associate with Chinese history. These are haplogroups that carry the genetic signature of some of the earliest modern humans to settle the East Asian coastal regions, people who arrived tens of thousands of years ago and whose descendants have been there ever since. What the maternal DNA reveals, combined with the paternal findings, is a picture of a family with extraordinarily deep roots in a specific part of the world. Both lines trace back through Shandong, through ancient northeastern China, through population groups that have been in that region for so long that their presence there predates any written record. The violence of the 20th century uprooted that family and scattered it. But the genetics preserved what the history tried to erase. The response to the documentary segment was significant across multiple communities. In mainland China, it resonated as part of a larger national conversation about the families that were divided and scattered by the events of 1949. The Communist Revolution is not a neutral subject in Chinese public discourse, and genealogy programs that touch on stories like Charles Chan's are navigating complicated political terrain. But the sheer number of families affected by that period means there is an enormous audience for whom Jackie Chan's story is not exotic or unusual. It is familiar. It is their own story, or their grandfather's story, or the story their grandmother never told anyone. In the Chinese diaspora, particularly in communities with roots in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, the reaction was perhaps even stronger. These are communities that were built largely by the kind of people Charles Chan represented. People who left mainland China under pressure, who changed what needed to be changed, who built new lives without looking back. Their children and grandchildren are now, in many cases, in exactly the position Jackie Chan was in before the documentary. They know there is a gap. They sense there is more to the story. They have no one left to ask. The popularity of DNA ancestry testing among people of Chinese descent has increased substantially in recent years, and discoveries like the one made about Jackie Chan's father are a significant part of why. When people see a story like this play out publicly, they are reminded that the technology can do for them what it did for Jackie. It can reach through the silence. It can retrieve what was hidden. It can give back a name. Jackie Chan has spoken about his father differently in the years since the documentary. There is a new fullness to the way he describes Charles Chan in interviews, a completeness that was not there before. He talks about him as a complete man now, not just as the father who raised him, but as Fang Daolong, the young man from Shandong who survived a war and crossed a border and made himself into something new. What comes through consistently in how Jackie describes this is not resentment, but admiration. Complicated, grief-tinged admiration, but admiration nonetheless. The story of what his father did is, in its own way, as remarkable as anything Jackie himself has accomplished. Fang Daolong survived a Japanese invasion. He survived a civil war. He made a decision in the chaos of 1949 that required a kind of courage that has nothing to do with physical bravery and everything to do with the harder kind, the willingness to let go of everything you were and build something new from nothing in a place you had never planned to be. He succeeded. He built a life. He raised a son who became famous enough that, half a century later, a documentary crew would consider his family history worth investigating, and he kept his secret so completely that not even that son, who has spent decades speaking openly about his own life in front of cameras, had any idea that the man who made him breakfast every morning was carrying a whole other identity inside him. There is something in that story that goes beyond Jackie Chan and beyond the specific history of mid-20th century China. It is a story about what people do to survive, about the choices that get made in impossible circumstances and the long shadows those choices cast, about the difference between the lives we build and the lives we were born into, and about the strange new power of science to bridge those two things, to reach back through the silence that survival sometimes requires and return what was buried there to the people who deserve to know it. Fang Daolong could not have known, crossing into Hong Kong in 1949, that one day a laboratory in the 21st century would read his genetic signature in his son's blood and say his real name out loud. He could not have known that the name he put down would come back, but it did. The son who inherited that name, even without knowing it, carried it across every country he visited, in every film he made, in every stunt he survived. He did not know what he was carrying. Now he does. Charles Chan lived and died as someone else. But science gave back what silence had buried. His real name was Fang Daolong, a Shandong survivor who crossed a border in 1949, built a quiet life, and raised a son the world would never forget. The DNA did not judge him. It simply remembered. And sometimes, that is all a secret needs to finally come home. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe.